Before we descend into the grim and gory world of medieval dentistry, don't forget to subscribe to Nightfall Notions for more tales that are equal parts unsettling and oddly soothing. Tonight's story is not for the faint of heart or the weak of tooth. Chapter 1. The Dawn of Dental Doom. The year was 1347, and the only thing spreading faster than the Black Death was the collective dread of toothaches. If you think modern dentistry is a nightmare, imagine a time when the best cure for a throbbing molar was a hammer, a pair of pliers, and a complete disregard for human dignity. Medieval dentistry wasn't just a profession, it was a blood sport, and the patient was always the losing team. The story begins, as most terrible things do, in a dimly lit tavern. The air was thick with the stench of ale, unwashed bodies, and the faint metallic tang of blood from the last poor soul who'd asked about tooth extraction. In the corner, a man named Gerard the Gnasher, self-proclaimed tooth drawer and part-time menace, was sharpening his tools. These tools, if you could call them that, were a collection of rusted iron hooks, jagged knives, and a singular, ominous pair of pliers that had seen more mouths than a tavern keg. Gerard didn't believe in anesthesia, unless you counted the pint of ale he'd force you to chug before the procedure. And even then, it was less about numbing the pain, and more about ensuring you wouldn't remember his butcher's handiwork. The first rule of medieval dentistry was simple. There were no rules. The second rule was that if you screamed loud enough, the next patient in line might flee, leaving you with a free beer for your troubles. Gerard's methods were crude, but they were effective. If your definition of effective included surviving the ordeal with at least half your teeth still in your head. His most famous technique, the twist and shout, involved hooking a tooth, wrenching it side to side until something cracked, and then yanking with the force of a man who'd just bet his last coin on the outcome. But Gerard was far from the worst. That honor went to Sister Agatha of the Bleeding Gums, a nun who believed toothaches were divine punishment, and that extracting them was a holy duty. Her tools were blessed, her hands were steady, and her bedside manner was non-existent. She worked in the shadowy corners of churches, where the echoes of screams blended seamlessly with the choir's hymns. Her signature move? The penitent's pull, where she'd recite scripture while levering your tooth out with a crucifix-shaped pick. Salvation never hurt so much. The medieval understanding of dental hygiene was, to put it mildly, disastrous. The prevailing theory was the toothworm, a mythical creature that burrowed into molars and caused agony. Treatments ranged from stuffing crushed beetles into cavities to cauterizing the gums with a red-hot poker. If you were lucky, the pain would stop. If you were unlucky, you'd just have a new kind of pain to focus on. And then there were the barbers. Ah, the barbers, the original jacks of all trades, masters of none. They could give you a shave, trim your hair, and yank a tooth, all with the same razor. Convenient? Maybe. Sanitary? Not even close. The barber-surgeon's chair was a place of dread, where men went in with a grimace and came out with fewer teeth and a newfound fear of scissors. By the end of the 14th century, dentistry had earned its reputation as one of the most brutal trades in history. It was a time when a toothache could lead to a public spectacle, with crowds gathering to watch some poor soul get their molars dismantled by a man who'd probably never washed his hands. The line between dentist and torturer was thin, and often it didn't exist at all. So the next time you flinch at the sound of a dental drill, remember, it could be worse. You could be in Gerard's chair, with nothing but a rusty hook and a prayer between you and dental oblivion. Chapter 2. Tools of Torment. If medieval dentistry was a blood sport, then its weapons were as crude as they were terrifying. The tools of the trade weren't just instruments, they were artifacts of suffering, each with its own special way of turning a simple tooth extraction into a scene straight from a torture manual. Let us now take a leisurely stroll through the nightmare toolbox of the medieval dentist, where every device came with a side of agony and a complete lack of sterilization. First, The star of the show, the pelican. No, not the bird. Though given its beak-like shape, the name wasn't entirely unearned. The dental pelican was a clawed contraption designed to grip a tooth and, through a combination of leverage and brute force, rip it free. The problem? It rarely gripped just the tooth. Often it took a chunk of gum, a fragment of jawbone, or, if the dentist was particularly enthusiastic, a neighboring tooth along for the ride. Its close cousin, the crow's beak, operated on the same principle but with even less precision, like trying to pluck a grape with a pair of rusty garden shears. Then there was the dreaded dental key, a device that looked like it belonged in a locksmith's workshop rather than a healer's hands. The key worked by clamping onto a tooth, twisting it until something gave, and then yanking it out with all the grace of a drunkard pulling a turnip from the mud. It was effective. If by effective you meant likely to leave the patient with a shattered jaw and a newfound fear of metalwork. Some versions even came with decorative handles, because nothing said "trust me with your mouth" like a little floral engraving on the instrument of your suffering. For those who preferred a more hands-on approach, there were forceps, though forceps is a generous term for what were essentially glorified pliers with the subtlety of a blacksmith's hammer. Medieval forceps came in all shapes and sizes, none of them correct. Some had curved ends for gripping molars, others had spikes for digging into stubborn teeth, and a few looked like they'd been repurposed from a carpenter's toolbox after a particularly slow day. The technique was simple. Clamp, wiggle, and pull until something came loose. Bonus points if it was the right tooth. But extraction tools were only half the arsenal. Before the main event, the dentist often had to contend with decay, and for that, they had the spoon. Not a spoon for eating, mind you, but a spoon for scooping, specifically, scooping out rotten pulp from inside a tooth. This delightful procedure involved jabbing a sharp, spoon-ended probe into the cavity and scraping until the patient either passed out or reconsidered their life choices. Sometimes, if the dentist was feeling fancy, they'd follow up with a dose of honey or ground herbs to soothe the wound. This did nothing, of course, except, perhaps, attract peas. Then came the cautery iron, the medieval equivalent of slamming the mute button on pain. The logic was straightforward. If a toothache was caused by bad humors or evil spirits, burning the gums would drive them out. In reality, it just replaced the original pain with a newer, hotter one. The iron was heated until it glowed red, then pressed directly into the flesh, searing nerve endings and, presumably, any hope of future happiness. The smell alone was enough to make bystanders reconsider ever eating again. And let's not forget the humble mallet. When all else failed, or when the dentist was just in a hurry, a few sharp taps with a hammer could loosen a tooth enough to make extraction easier. Of course, easier was relative. In the hands of an overzealous practitioner, the mallet could just as easily dislodge the tooth, part of the jaw, or the patient's will to live. The most horrifying part of all this wasn't just the tools themselves, but the fact that they were rarely cleaned. Rust, blood, and fragments of previous patients' teeth clung to them like badges of honor. Infection was practically guaranteed, and if you didn't die from the pain, you might well die from the gangrene that followed. So the next time you sit in a modern dentist's chair, surrounded by sterile instruments and the gentle hum of a drill, take a moment to appreciate how far we've come. Or better yet, don't, because ignorance is bliss, and bliss is what the medieval dentist robbed you of, one mangled tooth at a time. Chapter 3. The Barber-Surgeon Connection. If medieval dentistry had a mascot, it would be a blood-stained razor dangling from a sign outside a dimly lit shop, because nothing embodied the chaotic intersection of grooming and grievous bodily harm quite like the barber-surgeon. These were men of many talents, none of them reassuring. They could give you a shave, trim your hair, lance a boil, set a bone, and extract a tooth, all before lunch, and all with the same unwashed hands. Efficiency was their virtue, sanitation their mortal enemy. The barber-surgeon's rise to medical prominence was as baffling as it was horrifying. In an era when physicians were too busy debating whether illness was caused by imbalances of the four humors or demonic possession to bother with anything as mundane as surgery, the task fell to the barbers. After all, they already had sharp tools and experience cutting things. So why not expand their services? Thus, the same hands that tidied up a nobleman's beard might later be wrist-deep in his abscessed molar or, if the day was particularly eventful, sawing off a gangrenous limb. The barber's pole, that cheerful red and white spiral still seen outside old-fashioned shops, wasn't just a quaint relic of the past. It was a billboard advertising paint. The red symbolized blood, the white stood for bandages, and the pole itself was said to represent the stick patients would grip during procedures to steady their nerves. Or, more accurately, to give them something to bite down on when the barber-surgeon's idea of anesthesia was a firm slap on the back and a hearty, "This'll only hurt a bit." Dental work was just one of many horrors on the barber-surgeon's menu. A typical day might begin with a routine tooth extraction, segue into draining a cyst, and climax with a spot of bloodletting, because what better way to round off a morning of butchery than by draining a pint or two of excess blood? The tools of the trade were as multi-purpose as their owner. A single razor might be used for shaving, slicing open veins, and removing stubborn teeth, with nothing more than a quick wipe on an already filthy apron between tasks. The barber-surgeon's chair was less a seat and more an altar of suffering. It was often positioned near a window, not for the patient's comfort, but so the screams could attract passing customers. There was no privacy, no dignity, and certainly no informed consent. Just the grim understanding that if you sat down, you were leaving with fewer body parts than you arrived with. The barber-surgeon himself was usually a self-taught practitioner whose medical knowledge was a patchwork of superstition, hearsay, and whatever hadn't killed his last patient outright. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the barber-surgeon's trade was the sheer speed at which they worked. Time was money, and money was best earned by moving quickly before the patient could change their mind, or worse, pass out from the pain. A tooth extraction might take less than a minute, start to finish, with no regard for whether the tooth was the correct one or if the jawbone had just been cracked in the process. Finesse was for painters and poets. The barber-surgeon's philosophy was grip, twist, and pray. The overlap between barbers and surgeons wasn't just a quirk of the Middle Ages. It was institutionalized. In 1540, the Company of Barber-Surgeons was formally established in London, legally recognizing these dual professions as one and the same. The barbers handled haircuts and tooth extractions, while the surgeons, the slightly more educated among them, dealt with the more complex procedures, like amputations and trepanning, drilling holes in the skull, to let out evil spirits. Even then, the distinction was blurry at best. After all, when your barber was also your dentist and occasional battlefield medic, you learned not to ask too many questions. The legacy of the barber-surgeon lingers in unexpected ways. The modern dental drill's whine might be unsettling, but it's a far cry from the wet crunch of a tooth being wrenched free by pliers. The sterile, white-coated dentists of today would give their medieval counterparts a heart attack, assuming those predecessors still had enough blood left after their daily bleedings. So the next time you sit in a barber's chair, take a moment to appreciate the fact that the only thing being extracted today is a few inches of split ends. And if your barber suddenly reaches for a pair of pliers instead of scissors, Janin pebistantedame. Is he on this meeting the colder? Run as fast as your medieval legs can carry you. Chapter 4. No anesthesia, no problem. If medieval dentistry had a motto, it would have been pain is inevitable, but screaming is optional. The concept of pain management was, at best, an afterthought, a vague notion that perhaps something could be done about the agony. Certainly nothing that would slow down the dentist's brisk pace of tooth extraction. The solutions ranged from the inadequate to the outright sadistic, with a healthy dose of superstition mixed in for good measure. The most common form of anesthesia was alcohol, consumed in quantities that would make a Viking blush. Patients were encouraged to drink themselves into a stupor before the procedure, under the logic that if they were too drunk to stand, they might be too drunk to notice their tooth being yanked out with a pair of blacksmith's tongs. This method had one critical flaw. Alcohol thins the blood, turning what should have been a simple extraction into a scene resembling a butcher's shop after a particularly enthusiastic day. The patient might not remember the pain, but the dentist would certainly remember the mess. For those who preferred their pain relief with a side of mysticism, there were charms, incantations, and prayers. Certain words, when whispered over a throbbing molar, were said to dull the pain, or at least distract the patient long enough for the dentist to strike. A popular 14th century text recommended repeating the phrase, "Christ's tooth was painless, so shall mine be 3 times before spitting into a fire." Unsurprisingly, this did nothing for the toothache, though it did occasionally startle the dentist. Then there were the herbal remedies, a bewildering array of pastes, poultices, and potions that promised relief, but delivered little more than a foul taste. Henbane, a toxic plant with mild sedative properties, was sometimes chewed or applied to the gums, though the line between just enough to numb the pain and enough to stop the heart was perilously thin. Opium was known but rare, reserved for the wealthy or the very lucky, and even then, it was more likely to make the patient blissfully indifferent to their impending doom, rather than actually pain-free. But the true masterpiece of medieval pain management was distraction, a technique that relied not on dulling the senses, but on overwhelming them. Some dentists employed assistants whose sole job was to pinch, slap, or shout at the patient at the exact moment the tooth was pulled. Others relied on sudden loud noises, like banging a pot next to the patient's ear, in the hope that the shock would momentarily override the pain signals. The most creative practitioners used a combination of both, creating a chaotic symphony of suffering that left the patient too confused to protest. Of course, not all pain relief methods were so elaborate. Some dentists favored the direct approach, a swift knock to the head with a wooden mallet. The theory was simple: unconscious patients don't scream, but the execution was risky. Too light a blow, and the patient would merely be dazed and even more agitated. Too hard, and the dentist might find himself dealing with a skull fracture instead of a toothache. Still, for those who prized efficiency over ethics, it got the job done. The most tragic part of all this was that some of these methods did work, just not in the way they were intended. The terror of the procedure itself often overshadowed the original toothache, leaving the patient with a new, more immediate pain to focus on. A successful extraction wasn't one that was painless. It was one where the patient was too traumatized to complain afterward. By modern standards, it was barbaric. But in an era where life was short, pain was constant, and the line between medicine and misery was razor thin, it was just another day at the dentist's. The next time you wince at the pinch of a local anesthetic, remember, it could be worse. You could be biting down on a leather strap while a man with blood-stained sleeves tells you to just breathe through it. Chapter 5. The Toothworm Myth. Long before bacteria was discovered, before anyone understood the concept of cavities, medieval Europe had already identified the culprit behind tooth decay. Tiny, invisible worms gnawing away at teeth from the inside. The toothworm theory was as persistent as it was absurd, surviving for centuries, despite no one ever actually seeing these alleged dental parasites. But when you're dealing with the searing agony of a rotten molar, it's somehow comforting to imagine a villain, even if that villain is a fictional worm with a taste for enamel. The toothworm myth wasn't new to the Middle Ages. It dated back to ancient Mesopotamia, where cuneiform tablets prescribed spells to banish the wriggling tormentors. By the medieval era, the concept had evolved into something resembling biological fact. Medical texts describe these worms in vivid detail, attributing to them all sorts of malicious behaviors. Some claimed they had sharp teeth capable of chewing through bone. Others insisted they were spawned spontaneously from the foul humors of the mouth itself. The most creative accounts described them as miniature dragons, breathing fiery discomfort into the roots of teeth. The treatments for toothworms were as imaginative as they were useless. Since no one could see the worms, the goal was either to lure them out or kill them where they lurked. One popular method involved sitting with one's mouth open over a bowl of burning henbane seeds. The smoke, thick and narcotic, was supposed to suffocate the worms, forcing them to flee the tooth in a desperate bid for air. In reality, the patient usually just got lightheaded and hallucinated, which at least provided temporary distraction from the pain. For those who preferred a more hands-on approach, there was the worm extraction, a procedure that involved poking the infected tooth with a hot needle in hopes of spearing the invisible pest. Occasionally, the dentist would triumphantly display a bit of shredded nerve or a fragment of decay as proof of the worm's existence. Patients, desperate for any explanation of their suffering, usually believed it. After all, it was easier to blame a worm than accept that one's teeth were simply crumbling due to age, poor hygiene, or the medieval diet of ale and stale bread. Herbal remedies abounded, each more questionable than the last. A paste of crushed earthworms and honey might be packed into the cavity, based on the logic that worms wouldn't eat their own kind. Garlic, a panacea for everything from vampires to plague, was shoved into rotting molars to burn the invaders out. Some particularly desperate souls tried rinsing their mouths with mercury, which did indeed kill living creatures, including, eventually, the patient. The Church, never one to miss an opportunity to blend superstition with salvation, offered its own solutions. Prayers to Saint Apollonia, the patron saint of dentistry, who had her own teeth pulled out as part of her martyrdom, were said to be particularly effective against toothworms. Pilgrims might visit shrines where holy water was swished like mouthwash, or where relics of the saint, often fragments of dubious bone, were rubbed against aching jaws. Miraculous cures were reported, though these likely had more to do with the placebo effect than divine intervention. The persistence of the toothworm myth wasn't just a matter of ignorance. It was a coping mechanism. In a world where pain was constant and explanations were scarce, it was easier to personify suffering as a creature that could, theoretically, be defeated. Never mind that no one had ever seen a toothworm. Never mind that the treatments often made things worse. The idea of an enemy, something small, hateful, and removable, gave people hope. By the 17th century, the toothworm theory was finally beginning to crumble under the weight of actual science. Microscopes revealed the true culprits of decay, not worms, but the slow erosion of enamel and the spread of infection. Yet even then, the myth didn't die easily. Folk remedies for toothworms persisted in rural areas well into the 19th century, a testament to humanity's enduring love for a simple explanation, no matter how absurd. So the next time you floss, spare a thought for the toothworm, a monster that never existed, but for centuries was the most feared predator in the human mouth. And if you ever feel a twinge of dental discomfort, just be grateful your first instinct isn't to inhale toxic smoke or jab your gums with a red-hot wire. Progress, it seems, is measured not just in scientific discovery, but in the gradual abandonment of very bad ideas. Chapter 6. Public Spectacles of Pain. In an age before television, before sporting events, even before public executions lost their novelty, medieval Europe found a peculiar form of entertainment in the dental arts. Tooth extractions weren't merely medical procedures. They were performances, complete with audiences, applause, and the kind of enthusiastic heckling that would make a modern comedy club blush. For the common folk with little coin for theater, but an insatiable appetite for someone else's misery, the local tooth drawer stage was the cheapest show in town. The setting was usually some public square or marketplace, where the tooth drawer would set up his portable theater of pain. A sturdy chair, a table of ominous instruments, and perhaps a garish banner boasting of past triumphs, Gerard the Molar Mauler, 100 teeth pulled this month marked the performance space. The tooth drawer himself was equal parts showman and sadist, understanding that the key to a good extraction wasn't just removing the tooth, it was making the removal memorable. Crowds would gather as soon as the first cries of unclean tooth, "Begone!" rang out. Pantasis moved through the throng like carnival barkers, drumming up business by pointing out sufferers with swollen jaws and offering discounted rates for those willing to go first. The truly enterprising tooth drawers employed shills, perfectly healthy individuals who would pretend to have terrible toothaches, then miraculously recover after a dramatic and carefully staged extraction. Their exaggerated groans of relief were worth their weight in silver, convincing genuine sufferers that their pain too could vanish with one quick pull. The performance followed a familiar rhythm. The patient would be seated, perhaps given a token sip of ale for courage, then subjected to a lengthy inspection where the tooth drawer would proclaim the severity of the case to the crowd. This was the warm-up act, where the practitioner might wax poetic about the nest of worms he could see writhing beneath the gum, or describe the tooth as blacker than Satan's heart. The more gruesome the description, the louder the gasps from spectators. Then came the main event. With the crowd leaning in, the tooth drawer would select his instrument, always the largest pair of pliers for maximum visual impact, and begin his work. A good practitioner knew how to draw out the moment, applying just enough pressure to make the patient squirm, but not enough to actually remove the tooth. The best performers developed signature moves: the spinning yank, the surprise backhand pull, or the always popular leap and tug, where the dentist would literally jump into the air while maintaining his grip on the tooth. The crowd's role was crucial. They cheered good pulls and jeered bad ones. A particularly stubborn tooth that refused to budge might earn the dentist mocking chants, while a clean extraction, especially one accompanied by an impressive spray of blood, could bring thunderous applause. Some towns developed rivalries between competing tooth drawers, with supporters placing bets on whose patient would scream loudest or whose instrument would produce the most spectacularly rotten tooth. For the patients, this public humiliation was part of the price of treatment. A nobleman might pay extra for a private extraction behind closed doors, but the common folk had no such luxury. Their suffering was community property, their agony a shared experience. Yet many seemed to accept this bargain willingly. After all, a crowd's attention could be its own kind of anesthetic. The jeers and laughter created a strange camaraderie, turning personal pain into collective entertainment. The aftermath was its own spectacle. The extracted tooth would be displayed like a trophy, passed around for inspection. Particularly gruesome specimens, teeth with visible holes, proof positive of toothworms, twisted roots, or bizarre discolorations, might be mounted on small boards and added to the dentist's collection of horrors, a macabre portfolio advertising his skill. Patients still dazed and bleeding might be paraded about as living proof of the procedure's success, assuming they hadn't fainted outright. By the late Middle Ages, these public dental displays had evolved into full-fledged theatrical events. Traveling troupes combined extractions with morality plays, where the removal of a tooth symbolized the expulsion of sin. At country fairs, tooth drawers competed alongside fire eaters and trained bears for the crowd's attention. In some cities, municipal regulations tried to curb the worst excesses, banning dentists from deliberately prolonging procedures for dramatic effect, for instance, but the tradition proved hard to kill. What's perhaps most remarkable is how long this tradition endured. Well into the 18th century, public extractions remained popular entertainment, especially in rural areas. The rise of professional dentistry eventually killed the practice, but not before gifting the world one final, ironic twist: the phrase "drawing a crowd," which may well have originated from these literal public drawings of teeth. So the next time you sit in a sterile dental office with its quiet muzak and privacy screens, remember, it could be worse. You could be the star of your own involuntary one-act play, with 100 strangers cheering as your molar takes flight. Progress, it seems, isn't just about new techniques. It's about deciding some things shouldn't be spectator sports. Chapter 7. The Blacksmith's Role. In the grand hierarchy of medieval professions, blacksmiths occupied a strange and terrifying middle ground between craftsmen and emergency medical practitioners. When no barber surgeon could be found, when the traveling tooth drawer had moved on to the next village, when the pain became unbearable and all other options had been exhausted, there was always the blacksmith, a man whose primary qualifications for dentistry were strong forearms and a complete lack of squeamishness. The logic was superficially sound. Blacksmiths worked with metal, and so did dentists after a fashion. Both professions required tools that could grip, twist, and pry. Both demanded a certain tolerance for screaming. And crucially, blacksmiths were available in even the smallest villages, while trained medical practitioners were not. Thus began one of history's most horrifying crossovers. The era when the same hands that shoed your horse might also attempt to extract your molar. The blacksmith's approach to dentistry mirrored his approach to metalwork, direct, forceful, and utterly indifferent to subtlety. His tools were not the specialized instruments of even the crudest tooth drawer, but rather whatever happened to be cleanest, or more accurately, least filthy, in his workshop. Various nippers became impromptu dental forceps. A hammer and chisel, normally used for splitting hoof overgrowth, found new purpose in breaking apart stubborn molars. The smith's most terrifying adaptation was the use of his nail puller, a vicious iron claw designed to extract horseshoe nails from hooves, now repurposed for human teeth with predictable results. Technique varied from smith to smith, but certain universal truths emerged. Blacksmith dentist always worked standing up, lending his full body weight to each pull. He favored speed over precision, operating under the theory that a single brutal yank was somehow kinder than prolonged wiggling. Most crucially, he treated every tooth as if it were a recalcitrant nail in greenwood, something to be jerked free through sheer, overwhelming force. Patients quickly learned that requesting the blacksmith's services required both desperation and a willingness to sacrifice adjacent teeth in the process. The setting alone was enough to unsettle even the hardiest souls. Unlike the barber-surgeon's shop or the public square where tooth drawers plied their trade, the blacksmith's domain was a hellish landscape of fire and noise. The air reeked of burning coal and singed hoof. The anvil rang with blows that set teeth on edge, both figuratively and, in unfortunate cases, literally. Patients were often positioned near the forge, ostensibly for better light, though the heat and smoke did little to calm already frayed nerves. One particular account from 1423 describes a blacksmith in Burgundy who took the concept of hot tools rather too literally. Frustrated by a stubborn molar, he heated his pliers in the forge until they glowed faintly red, reasoning, if one could call it reasoning, that the searing metal would encourage the tooth to release its grip. The tooth did eventually come free, though whether this was due to the heat or the fact that half the jawbone shattered remains unclear. The patient reportedly survived, though he took his meals through a straw thereafter. What blacksmiths lacked in medical knowledge, they made up for in creativity. One enterprising smith in Yorkshire developed a system of ropes and pulleys attached to his ceiling beams, allowing him to apply truly alarming amounts of vertical force to stubborn teeth. Another, in Normandy, crafted custom iron mouth props shaped like horseshoes to keep patients from biting down at inopportune moments. The most infamous was a German smith who allegedly used his trip hammer, normally employed for shaping glowing metal, to tap teeth loose, though this method had an unfortunate tendency to leave patients unconscious before the actual extraction began. The results were predictably catastrophic. Blacksmiths had no concept of sterile procedure, no understanding of dental anatomy, and no patience for half measures. Broken jaws were common. Unintentional extractions of neighboring teeth were practically guaranteed. The lucky patients merely lost teeth, The unlucky ones acquired new and interesting infections from tools that had recently been inside a horse's hoof. Yet despite the risks, or perhaps because of them, blacksmiths remained a last resort for dental care in rural areas well into the 17th century. Their legacy endures in unexpected ways. The modern dental forceps' basic design owes more to the blacksmith's tools than to any medical instrument. The term toothsmith lingered in some dialects long after the practice died out. And in particularly remote villages, one can still find elderly residents who swear that a proper tooth pulling requires a smith's grip and God's mercy. So the next time you sit in a modern dental chair with its precision instruments and nerve-soothing ambience, spare a thought for those who came before you, those brave or foolish souls who placed their faith in a man better suited to shoeing stallions than saving smiles. And if you ever catch yourself complaining about your dentist's fees, remember, at least they're not charging by the pound of pressure applied. Chapter 8. Medieval Dental Experts. The medieval world teemed with self-proclaimed dental specialists, each more dubious than the last. These were men, and occasionally women, who had somehow convinced others, or more often themselves, that they possessed secret knowledge of teeth and their ailments. What united them was not skill nor training, but rather the audacity to declare themselves experts in a field where expertise was impossible to verify, and failure carried no consequences beyond the muffled screams of their patients. At the bottom of this dubious hierarchy were the wandering tooth drawers, rootless charlatans who drifted from village to village like dental ghosts. They arrived unannounced, set up temporary stalls in market squares, and departed just as swiftly, usually before their victims could properly assess the damage. Their tools were minimal, their methods brutal, and their advertisements grandiose. A typical tooth drawer might proclaim himself Grand Master of the royal teeth, despite having never been within 50 miles of a royal court, or boast of secret techniques learned from Moorish scholars or ancient Roman texts. The more elaborate the title, the more suspect the practitioner. These itinerant frauds perfected the art of the theatrical extraction. Many employed sleight-of-hand tricks to prove their efficacy, palming bits of bone or animal teeth to present as evidence of their work. Some used hidden levers to make chairs suddenly tilt backward at the moment of extraction, distracting patients from the fact that nothing had actually been removed. The most cunning among them kept a small vial of vinegar or pepper water to sprinkle into a patient's mouth during the inspection, the resulting grimace and watering eyes serving as proof of terrible infection that required immediate and expensive treatment. Slightly more respectable, though no more competent, were the monastic dental practitioners. Certain religious orders took it upon themselves to care for both souls and molars, blending prayer with procedures in ways that satisfied spiritual needs more than dental ones. Brother Arnulf, the Gargler, a 13th century Benedictine known for his dental ministrations, favored a treatment that involved alternating verses of psalms with rinses of consecrated wine. His success rate was poor, but his patients died smelling faintly of sacramental grapes, which was apparently consolation enough. The monasteries also produced some of history's most creative and least effective dental remedies. One popular text attributed to an anonymous Franciscan recommended packing a rotten tooth with a paste of crushed pearls and saint's bone dust, then sealing it with wax from Easter candles. Another suggested hanging the jawbone of a hanged man around one's neck to prevent toothaches, a remedy that worked splendidly until one needed to eat or speak. Monastic dental care operated on the principle that if God had intended teeth to remain pain-free, He wouldn't have given humans the capacity to invent such interesting ways to torment them. Then there were the academic dentists, such as they were. A handful of university-trained physicians dabbled in dental theory, though their knowledge was largely speculative and their practical experience non-existent. The typical medical scholar's approach to dentistry involved 1. Consulting ancient Greek or Roman texts. 2. misinterpreting them completely. 3. Developing an elaborate theory based on this misunderstanding. 4. Never actually touching a patient's mouth. These learned men wrote lengthy treatises on dental humors and astrological influences on tooth health, all while maintaining a safe distance from actual teeth. When forced to practice, their methods tended toward the bizarre. Professor Heinrich of Padua famously treated toothaches by having patients face east during treatment, to align with planetary energies, while holding a live frog in each hand to draw out the pain. His clinical notes mention many satisfied customers, though whether this satisfaction came from dental relief or simply from being allowed to release the frogs remains unclear. Woman played a surprising role in medieval dental care, though rarely an acknowledged one. The wise women of villages often served as de facto dentists, drawing on folk remedies passed down through generations. Their methods were sometimes gentle, herbal poultices, massage, and sometimes alarmingly direct, tying one end of a string to the bad tooth and the other to a slammed door. These practitioners occupied a strange middle ground, respected enough to be sought out in times of need, yet vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft if a procedure went awry. A successful extraction might earn a woman praise. A failed one might earn her a pyre. Perhaps the most dangerous experts were the aristocratic amateurs, wealthy nobles who dabbled in dentistry as a macabre hobby. With no need for income and no fear of consequences, these gentlemen practitioners experimented freely on their servants and tenants. Duke Otto of Brunswick kept detailed journals of his dental endeavors, including one entry that cheerfully noted, "Tried new method on stable boy today. Heated iron rod applied directly to gum. Subject became unruly, requiring restraint. Tooth eventually removed, along with portion of lower lip." What united all these practitioners, from the lowliest charlatan to the most educated quack, was absolute confidence in their own abilities. In an age without licensing, without standards, and without any real understanding of oral health, the only qualification that mattered was the willingness to declare oneself an expert. The results were predictable: a trail of broken teeth, shattered jaws, and occasional miracles, though the latter were far outnumbered by the former. The legacy of these medieval experts lingers in unexpected ways. Modern dentistry's emphasis on licensure and education grew directly from the chaos of this era. The white coat, now a symbol of medical authority, was in part a reaction to the flashy, dubious costumes of wandering tooth drawers. Even the dental chair's design evolved to prevent patients from fleeing mid-procedure, a very real concern when your practitioner might be part showman, part sadist, and entirely unqualified. So the next time you sit in a dentist's office, surrounded by diplomas and sterilized tools, remember, it could be worse. You could be in the hands of a self-taught monk insisting that your molar pain is caused by an imbalance of phlegm, or a nobleman's hunting lodge where dental tools double as torture devices. Progress, it seems, is measured not just in scientific advances, but in the gradual extinction of very bad ideas, and the people who champion them. Chapter 9. The Plague's Silver Lining. The Black Death ravaged Europe with a thoroughness that would impress even the most ambitious medieval dentist. As villages emptied and corpses piled high, an ironic truth emerged. Mass mortality did wonders for the average survivor's dental health. While the plague busied itself wiping out a third of the continent, it inadvertently solved several long-standing dental problems through its characteristically brutal methodology. First and most obviously, the plague solved the problem of sugar. With trade routes collapsing and entire noble houses being erased overnight, the steady trickle of Eastern spices and Mediterranean sugars slowed to nothing. What little sweetener remained became impossibly expensive, forcing even the wealthiest lords to reduce their consumption of honeyed treats and candied fruits. The sudden scarcity meant fewer cavities for those who survived, though this was small consolation when every sneeze might herald the end times. The lower classes, who had never enjoyed sugar to begin with, found grim humor in watching their social superiors suffer withdrawal from what had been considered a basic necessity, like watching a knight mourn the loss of his favorite warhorse while standing knee-deep in corpses. The plague also revolutionized dental employment. Many of the worst tooth drawers and barber surgeons succumbed early to the pestilence, being in constant contact with bodily fluids and rarely bothering to wash their hands. Their passing created a temporary vacuum in the dental marketplace, allowing marginally more competent practitioners to take their place. Some towns even saw the rise of plague dentists, opportunistic souls who roamed from village to village, offering extractions alongside their primary services of selling dubious plague cures and last rites. These transitional figures blended old superstitions with new desperation, creating such memorable treatments as rubbing garlic on teeth to ward off miasmas while simultaneously pulling them. Dental hygiene improved in unexpected ways during the plague years. The widespread, if misguided, belief that bad smells spread disease led to a sudden cultural emphasis on oral freshness. People chewed pungent herbs not just to cover the stench of decay, but in the sincere hope that doing so might prevent infection. Mint, once a casual garnish, became a life-saving necessity. Some overzealous souls took this to extremes, rinsing with vinegar or scrubbing their teeth with powdered charcoal until their gums bled, preferring self-inflicted pain to the imagined alternative of breathing in death itself. The demographic collapse had another unexpected benefit: more food per capita. With fewer mouths to feed, survivors found themselves eating better than they had in generations. Fresh meat became temporarily affordable as livestock outnumbered their potential consumers. Fruits rotted on untended trees, free for the taking. This sudden abundance of varied nutrition strengthened immune systems and, consequently, teeth. The peasant who had once subsisted on coarse bread and thin ale now enjoyed occasional fresh vegetables and meat, not out of any social progress, but simply because there was no one left to stop him from taking it. Even the psychological landscape of dental care shifted in the plague's wake. Confronted daily with grotesque suffering and sudden death, many patients found they could endure a tooth extraction with newfound stoicism. What was momentary pain compared to the endless procession of funeral carts? Some particularly pious individuals even sought out tooth drawers as a form of penance, voluntarily submitting to extractions as they might to self-flagellation, a curious case of medical treatment merging with spiritual mortification. The dental profession itself underwent a morbid evolution. Some tooth drawers began incorporating plague imagery into their advertisements, claiming their services could prevent infection by removing corrupt portals where disease might enter. A thriving market emerged for amulets made from extracted teeth, said to ward off the pestilence. Entrepreneurial grave robbers did brisk business selling skulls to medical students, creating an odd situation where the demand for dental education increased, even as the population it served dwindled. Perhaps the plague's greatest gift to dentistry was the way it reshaped urban landscapes. Overcrowded, filth-strewn cities saw their populations decimated, allowing survivors to spread into previously cramped quarters. The resulting improvement in sanitation reduced rates of infection and malnutrition, both significant contributors to dental problems. Wells were cleaned as a matter of survival, inadvertently providing cleaner water that left fewer mineral deposits on teeth. The widespread burning of plague victims' belongings reduced the flea population, which in turn reduced the incidence of typhus, a disease whose high fevers often led to tooth grinding and enamel damage. Of course, these improvements came at a price no sane person would willingly pay. For every tooth the plague saved through reduced sugar consumption, it cost 1,000 lives. For every marginally more competent dentist who rose to prominence, 100 skilled craftsmen perished. The demographic shifts that allowed better nutrition also shattered families and erased entire cultural traditions. The Black Death was at best a catastrophically blunt instrument for dental reform, like using a sledgehammer to tap in a nail or a blacksmith's tongs to extract a molar. Yet history moves in strange ways. The same devastation that left Europe reeling also cleared the ground for new ideas to take root. The post-plague world saw the gradual abandonment of toothworm theories and a slow move toward empirical observation. The sudden labor shortages gave surviving workers more bargaining power, including access to better food and living conditions. And the collective trauma of the pandemic created a generation less inclined to accept needless suffering, whether from disease or from dental quackery. So the next time you enjoy a painless cleaning or a cavity filled with precision, spare a thought for the millions who died to make it possible. Not that they had any choice in the matter. Progress, it seems, sometimes wears a cloak of pestilence and leaves better teeth in its wake. Chapter 10. Royal Toothaches. The crowned heads of medieval Europe proved one universal truth about dentistry. No amount of gold, no army of servants, and no divine right could spare a monarch from the same primitive horrors that plagued the lowliest peasant. If anything, royal dental experiences were often worse precisely because their wealth and status attracted the most ambitious, and consequently most dangerous, practitioners. Kings and queens suffered through experimental treatments no starving farmer would tolerate, proving that when it came to teeth, privilege meant only that one could afford more elaborate forms of torture. Take King Philip IV's reign in the early 14th century coincided with a particularly brutal dental misfortune. His court physicians recorded excruciating toothaches that left the monarch unable to chew, speak, or even think clearly for weeks at a time. The royal remedy? A daily regimen of rinsing with powdered pearls dissolved in vinegar, followed by applications of ground emerald paste. A treatment so expensive it nearly bankrupted the royal jeweler, yet accomplished nothing beyond turning the king's teeth a faint shade of green. When the pain became unbearable, Philip's physicians resorted to cauterizing his gums with white-hot needles blessed by the Pope himself. The treatment failed, but did inspire the king to burn a few extra heretics in retaliation. England's Queen Elizabeth I presented one of history's most famous cases of royal dental neglect. By her 50s, the Virgin Queen's teeth had turned black from her legendary sweet tooth, a cruel irony for a woman so obsessed with her public image. Courtiers described her breath as so foul it could wilt flowers at 20 paces, yet her dentists dared not suggest extractions for fear of offending her vanity. The compromise was equally disastrous. A daily application of honey-sweetened wine to mask the odor, which only accelerated the decay. When foreign ambassadors were granted audience, the queen took to holding a scented handkerchief near her face, not out of coyness, but as a desperate air freshener. Her eventual tooth loss became so severe that speeches had to be rewritten to accommodate her lisp, and portraits were carefully angled to hide her collapsing profile. Royalty faced unique dental hazards beyond simple decay. King Wenceslaus V of Bohemia discovered this in 1393, when political rivals imprisoned him and deliberately denied him any dental care. The chroniclers note his captors went so far as to serve him nothing but hard bread and sour wine, knowing full well the state of his teeth. By the time he was freed, the king could consume only liquids, though this did little to dampen his enthusiasm for executing those responsible. Some monarchs took unusually hands-on approaches to their dental care. Emperor Charles V of Spain, suffering from an impacted wisdom tooth in 58, personally supervised his own extraction. The procedure took 2 hours, required 4 grown men to hold the imperial jaw steady, and allegedly produced a tooth so large the surgeon kept it as a trophy. Charles rewarded the man with a generous pension, though whether this was for his skill or his discretion remains unclear. The emperor's diary from that week contains several pages torn out in apparent frustration. The truly tragic cases were those young royals subjected to preventative dentistry. Young Prince Arthur of England endured weekly tooth-toughening sessions where servants rubbed his gums with rough linen dipped in wine and salt. The theory held that this would make his teeth resilient. The practice left him with permanent gum recession by age 12. Princess Margarita of Austria suffered through nightly applications of mercury-laced ointment meant to keep her teeth white, resulting in gradual poisoning that may have contributed to her early death. Even royal children weren't spared. The infant Dauphin of France had his gums scored with gold needles to ensure proper tooth alignment, a practice that nearly killed him from infection. The intersection of royal vanity and dental ignorance produced some truly bizarre moments in medical history. When King Sigismund of Poland developed a toothache during the Council of Constance in 1417, he summoned Europe's finest minds, not to treat him, but to debate whether papal blessing of the extraction tools would violate canon law. The three-day theological argument that followed became so heated that by the time they reached a verdict, the king's abscess had burst on its own. Perhaps no royal dental story is more grimly ironic than that of King Louis XIV. The Sun King's mouth became a literal battleground as his dentists competed for favor through increasingly aggressive treatments. One particularly ambitious practitioner removed all the king's upper teeth in a single session using a specially designed royal pelican tool gilded with gold leaf. The subsequent infection nearly killed Louis, leading to the execution of the dentist, not for incompetence, but for the treasonous act of making the monarch appear weak. The king's eventual dentures, crafted from solid ivory, were so ill-fitting they distorted his speech and made eating nearly impossible, forcing chefs to invent pureed versions of every dish in the French court. These royal dental catastrophes had unexpected historical consequences. Queen Anne of Great Britain's chronic tooth infections left her nearly incapable of speaking during crucial political negotiations, possibly altering the course of the War of Spanish Succession. Tsar Peter the Great's fascination with dentistry. He practiced extractions on his servants, distracted him from governing at key moments. Some historians argue that King John of England's famously bad temper stemmed from constant dental pain, suggesting the Magna Carta might never have been signed if only someone had given the king proper tooth powder. The final irony lay in royal burial customs. While peasants might have their best teeth stolen by grave robbers for use in amulets, kings and queens faced the opposite problem. Their carefully preserved corpses often showed better dental hygiene in death than they'd enjoyed in life. The mummified remains of Ferdinand I of Naples revealed teeth stuffed with scented linen, giving him better breath in his tomb than he'd had at his own coronation. So the next time you wince at a dental bill, remember, it could be worse. You could be a medieval monarch paying a fortune to have your teeth scrubbed with ground rubies, or a queen watching your portraitist subtly repaint your collapsing jawline. Royalty might have slept on silk and dined on peacock, but when it came to dentistry, they suffered just like everyone else, only with more gold-plated instruments and a higher chance of having their dentist executed afterward. Chapter 11. The Rise of the Tooth Puller. In the chaotic ecosystem of medieval professions, the tooth puller occupied a unique niche, feared like an executioner, paid like a skilled tradesman, and trusted about as much as a back-alley dice dealer. These were men who had turned human suffering into a commodity, recognizing earlier than most that pain was one of the few truly universal currencies. The rise of their profession mirrored the growing desperation of populations increasingly afflicted by tooth decay, but still blissfully ignorant of its causes or prevention. The typical tooth puller began his career as either a failed barber surgeon or a particularly ambitious blacksmith's apprentice. Some learned their trade under the dubious tutelage of itinerant practitioners, who wandered between towns like dental mercenaries. Others simply picked up a pair of pliers one day and discovered they had both the stomach and the strong grip required for the work. What they all shared was an understanding that in a world teeming with toothaches, but devoid of actual dentistry, brute force and sheer confidence could build a thriving business. By the 15th century, tooth pullers had established themselves as fixtures in most sizable towns. Their shops were easily identifiable by the garish signs depicting gleaming teeth, or the more candid ones showing a pair of iron forceps. Some took to displaying strings of pulled teeth in their windows like morbid trophies, each specimen representing both a cured patient and a walking advertisement. The more entrepreneurial pullers organized these displays by size and condition, offering price tiers. A simple front tooth extraction might cost a few pennies, while wrestling out a rotten molar could command a day's wages. The tools of the trade evolved from simple pliers to elaborate specialized instruments, though none could be described as gentle. The pelican, with its claw-like grips, remained popular for its theatricality, if not its precision. Newer inventions like the goat's foot lever promise more controlled extractions, but usually delivered only more creative types of damage. Some pullers favored screw-operated devices that applied gradual pressure, theoretically allowing for cleaner removal. In practice, these often simply prolonged the agony as the mechanism jammed or the tooth shattered under the strain. What truly set professional tooth pullers apart was their understanding of spectacle. A successful extraction required not just technical skill but showmanship. The best practitioners developed signature flourishes, spinning the extracted tooth on a finger before presenting it to the patient, or making the pliers dance in their hands beforehand to demonstrate their dexterity. Some employed drummers to mask the sounds of screaming, while others hired assistants whose sole job was to dramatically restrain thrashing patients. The performance mattered as much as the procedure itself, transforming what should have been a medical intervention into something closer to street theater. The social standing of tooth pullers was a study in contradictions. Though their services were in constant demand, they were rarely welcomed as equals by other medical practitioners. Physicians dismissed them as mere manual laborers, while barber surgeons resented them for encroaching on their territory. The general public regarded them with a mixture of gratitude and terror. No one wanted to need a tooth puller, but everyone was relieved to know where to find one when the time came. This uneasy relationship was perfectly captured in the nicknames they accumulated. Molar Mike, the gum butcher, or simply that bastard with the pliers. Regulation of the profession was virtually non-existent. While guilds controlled most trades, tooth pullers operated in a gray area, too medical for the craftsmen's guilds, too crude for the physicians' colleges. Some cities attempted to impose standards requiring pullers to demonstrate their skills on animal jaws, or, in particularly cruel cases, on condemned criminals. But most jurisdictions simply taxed them like any other business, and looked the other way so long as they didn't kill too many patients. The rare attempts to prosecute incompetent pullers usually founded on the difficulty of proving whether a death resulted from the extraction or from the infection that followed. Women found unusual opportunities in this unregulated field. While barred from most medical professions, they could and did establish themselves as tooth pullers, particularly for female patients who preferred not to endure the indignity of strange men poking in their mouths. Some of the most successful operators were women who combined tooth pulling with midwifery or herbalism, creating what might be considered medieval dental spas, places where one could have a tooth extracted, a baby delivered, and a love potion purchased all in one visit. The profession reached its zenith in the early Renaissance, when the combination of increasing sugar consumption and still primitive dental knowledge created booming demand. The most successful pullers became minor celebrities, their names whispered with equal parts awe and dread. Hans von Aachen's 1603 portrait The Tooth Puller immortalized the type, a strong-armed man in fine clothes, his tools gleaming as a crowd of onlookers watches with horrified fascination. The painting perfectly captures the strange duality of the profession, part healer, part performer, all menace. This golden age couldn't last. As proper dentistry began emerging in the 18th century, the crude methods of the tooth pullers fell increasingly out of favor. The invention of effective anesthesia made their speed-based techniques obsolete. The growing understanding of germ theory rendered their unsterilized tools unacceptable. By the Victorian era, what had once been a feared and respected profession had dwindled to a handful of back-alley practitioners, serving only the most desperate clients. Yet the tooth pullers left an enduring mark on both language and culture. The phrase pulling teeth entered the lexicon as shorthand for any difficult task. Their showmanship evolved into modern dental marketing, the white coats and diplomas in today's dental offices serving much the same purpose as the strings of teeth in their medieval predecessors' windows. And in remote villages, one can still occasionally find elderly residents who speak wistfully of the old tooth pullers, not because they were particularly effective, but because they faced the problem of dental pain head-on, with no false promises or delicate pretensions. In a world full of suffering, there was something refreshing about practitioners who acknowledged that sometimes the solution had to hurt as much as the problem. Chapter 12. Folklore and False Cures. Before modern dentistry offered the cold comfort of Novocaine and precision drills, medieval Europe teemed with folk remedies for toothaches, an eclectic mix of desperate superstition, half-remembered herbalism, and outright witchcraft. When faced with the searing agony of rotting molars, peasants and nobles alike turned to cures that ranged from the merely useless to the actively dangerous, proving that fear of pain could make people try anything twice. One of the most enduring beliefs involved the magical properties of frogs. Across Europe, variations of the same basic remedy persisted. Catch a frog, preferably at midnight during a full moon, and either rub it directly against the aching tooth or burn it to ashes first. The theory held that frogs, being cold-blooded creatures, could draw out the heat of infection. In practice, this resulted in countless villagers stumbling through moonlit marshes, only to end up with both toothache and amphibian saliva in their mouths. The more fastidious preferred to wear frog bones in pouches around their necks, though this preventative measure worked about as well as one might expect, which is to say, not at all. The plant kingdom offered its own dubious solutions. Garlic was universally recommended, though application methods varied wildly. Some insisted on stuffing crushed cloves directly into the cavity, guaranteeing both searing pain and the permanent alienation of anyone standing downwind. Others swore by rinses of garlic-infused wine, creating what must have been history's most aggressively aromatic breath freshener. Henbane, a toxic nightshade plant, appeared in numerous remedies despite its well-documented side effects of hallucinations and death. A particularly cruel preparation involved packing henbane seeds into the aching tooth and lighting them, creating a noxious smoke meant to drive out the pain and occasionally the patient's consciousness as well. Animal products featured prominently in dental folklore. A popular English cure involved boiling earthworms in oil and using the resulting grease as a gum rub. German practitioners recommended rinsing with water that had washed a ferret's teeth, apparently believing some mystical transference of dental fortitude would occur. The wealthier classes might employ powdered unicorn horn, usually narwhal tusk, or bezoar stones in their treatments, paying small fortunes for remedies that worked exactly as well as the much cheaper frog ashes. The line between medicine and magic blurred completely in many toothache cures. Protective charms featuring the word abracadabra, arranged in shrinking triangles, were worn around the neck to shrink tooth pain. Moonlight collected in silver bowls became celestial mouthwash. Some Scottish clans developed elaborate rituals involving carved oak twigs that had to be rubbed against the tooth while reciting specific rhymes backward. The common thread in all these remedies was their meticulous specificity. The exact wording, timing, and materials mattered as much as the procedure itself, suggesting that faith in the ritual provided more relief than the ritual ever could. The Church offered its own alternatives to these pagan-tinged cures, though they were no more effective. Prayers to Saint Apollonia, the patron saint of dentistry, formed the backbone of Christian toothache remedies. The saint's gruesome martyrdom, having all her teeth extracted before being burned, made her particularly sympathetic to dental sufferers. Devotees might recite special prayers while holding a tooth-shaped piece of lead against their jaw, or make pilgrimages to churches that claimed possession of one of her extracted teeth. Some particularly desperate souls attempted to recreate her suffering by having healthy teeth pulled in hopes of miraculous relief, a perfect example of medieval logic where the cure perfectly mirrored the disease. Seasonal cures abounded, each tied to celestial events or holy days. A toothache experienced during the dog days of summer might require treatment with dog saliva. A winter toothache demanded snow, melted in the mouth under specific constellations. The spring equinox was considered particularly potent for dental magic, leading to elaborate rituals involving fresh eggs and sprouting grains. Midsummer Eve saw villagers gathering special ferns believed to confer dental health when harvested at exactly midnight, though the difficulty of identifying plants in the dark probably explained why so many of these gatherings ended with accidental poisonings instead. The wealthy had access to equally absurd but far more expensive alternatives. Gold leaf applied to cavities promised to seal out pain while displaying one's wealth. Round pearls in vinegar made for a popular, if ineffective, medieval mouthwash among the aristocracy. Some noblewomen wore rings set with toothstones, actually fossilized shark teeth, that were supposed to draw out pain when pressed against the cheek. The fact that these remedies persisted generation after generation despite their obvious failures speaks volumes about the power of wishful thinking. Perhaps the most psychologically revealing remedies were those based on sympathetic magic, the idea that pain could be transferred to another object or creature. Countless variations existed: spitting into a frog's mouth before releasing it, driving a nail into a particular tree while reciting a spell, or tying a knotted string around the jaw, then burning it. Some villages maintained tooth trees, studded with hundreds of nails hammered in by generations of sufferers. The sheer proliferation of these practices suggests they provided something modern medicine often lacks: a sense of active participation in one's own healing, however illusory that participation might be. The legacy of these folk remedies lingers in unexpected ways. Modern dental phobias may stem in part from centuries of ineffective treatments that only added to patients' suffering. The theatrical nature of contemporary dental marketing echoes the showmanship of medieval healers. Even today's home remedies, clove oil for pain, saltwater rinses for infection, are distant descendants of this folk tradition, the rare examples that actually contain some beneficial properties. What's most striking about these historical cures isn't their strangeness, but their universality. Every culture developed its own variations on the same desperate themes, proving that toothaches have always driven humans to spectacular feats of irrationality. The fundamental misunderstanding that dental pain was something to be drawn out rather than the symptom of a physical problem persisted well into the 19th century, delaying real medical progress for generations. So the next time you pop an aspirin for a toothache, spare a thought for your ancestors who might have been chewing on willow bark, one of the few effective folk remedies, while wearing a pouch of frog bones around their neck. Progress, it seems, sometimes moves in circles, though thankfully today's circles don't involve burning henbane seeds in our mouths or rubbing our gums with ferret teeth. Some traditions are best left to the history books, where they can't hurt anyone anymore. Chapter 13. The Executioner's Side Hustle. Medieval executioners occupied a peculiar social position, shunned as unclean yet indispensable, feared as agents of death yet sought out as healers. This paradox reached its zenith in their unexpected role as dental practitioners, where their daily work with blades and brute force translated neatly into a lucrative second career: extracting teeth. The executioner dentist became a familiar nightmare in countless towns. A man equally adept at separating heads from bodies and molars from jaws, often using the same tools for both jobs. The path to this dual career began with simple economics. Most towns could only support an executioner's salary through occasional work, leaving these professionals with considerable free time between hangings and beheading. At the same time, their constant handling of sharp instruments and familiarity with human anatomy made them oddly qualified for dental work. By the 14th century, it had become common for executioners to advertise tooth-drawing services, their gallows-side booths doing steady business on non-execution days. Executioners brought unique advantages to the dental profession. Their strong arms, honed by years of swinging axes, could remove even the most stubborn tooth with a single decisive pull. Their intimate knowledge of how much force a human body could withstand prevented the embarrassing accidents common among gentler practitioners, who sometimes found themselves holding a tooth while their patient slumped dead from shock. Most importantly, their reputation for ruthlessness meant patients rarely argued about payment afterward. No one wanted to haggle with a man who might someday fit them for a noose. The tools of these dual professions overlapped in disturbing ways. An executioner's axe, when carefully balanced against a patient's jaw, could serve as an impromptu tooth lever. The iron hooks used to position corpses became useful for prying open resistant mouths. Even the dreaded thumbscrews found new purpose as dental clamps, though their application tended to make patients considerably less cooperative. The most enterprising executioner dentists maintained separate tools for each profession, though this was less out of hygiene concerns and more because bloodstains made potential dental patients nervous. Technique varied by practitioner, but most executioner dentists favored the direct approach. Where a barber-surgeon might attempt to loosen a tooth before extraction, the executioner typically went straight for maximum force. Their signature move became known as the headsman's pull, a swift, powerful yank that removed the tooth, often with a section of jawbone attached. Patients reported hearing an ominous cracking sound moments before the pain hit, much like condemned prisoners described hearing the whistle of the falling axe before darkness took them. The setting for these procedures added to their terror. Many executioner dentists operated near their primary workplace, meaning patients had to walk past the gallows or chopping block to reach the treatment chair. Some particularly macabre practitioners left their instruments of execution on display during dental procedures, perhaps as a subtle reminder of what could happen to non-paying clients. The smells of blood and burning flesh from recent executions lingered in the air, blending with the metallic tang of tooth extractions to create an atmosphere few modern dental offices would dare replicate. Public perception of executioner dentists was complex. While no one wanted to be seen socializing with these pariahs, their dental services were in constant demand. Wealthier patients might visit under cover of darkness, their faces hidden by hoods, while peasants simply accepted that beggars couldn't be choosers. Some executioners cultivated this ambivalence, adopting ominous pseudonyms for their dental work like the Gray Tooth Taker or Dr. Steele. A few even wore different colored robes for each profession, black for executions, dark red for dentistry, creating one of history's first examples of medical branding. The overlap between the two professions wasn't merely practical but philosophical. An executioner's daily confrontation with mortality gave them a uniquely pragmatic approach to pain management. Where other practitioners might offer false reassurances or herbal placebos, executioner dentists were famously blunt. "It will hurt terribly, then stop," was a typical prognosis. Their waiting areas contained none of the soothing decorations found in barber-surgeons' shops, just hard benches and perhaps a skeletal hourglass to remind patients of life's brevity. Quality of care varied wildly. Some executioners took genuine pride in their dental work, developing specialized techniques and maintaining relatively clean tools. The infamous Parisian executioner, Henri le Dentiste, a nickname he embraced, became renowned for his sword-hand extraction method, using his fencing training to remove teeth with precise flicks of the wrist. Others treated dentistry as a grim joke, like the Augsburg executioner who kept a running tally comparing his dental and execution numbers on a public chalkboard. The decline of executioner dentists came gradually, as proper dentistry professionalized and public sensibilities shifted. By the 18th century, most European cities had banned the practice, though rural areas continued it well into the industrial age. The last known executioner dentist, a Bavarian named Karl the Clean, operated until 1832. his business cards proudly listing both professions until local authorities forced him to choose. He reportedly selected dentistry, claiming it offered better long-term prospects. The legacy of these fearsome practitioners lingers in unexpected ways. The modern dental profession's emphasis on sterility and precision began partly as a reaction to executioner dentists' brutal methods. The traditional white coat may have originated as a deliberate contrast to the executioner's black robes. Even today's dental fear stems in part from centuries of associating tooth extraction with the instruments of death. So the next time you sit in a dentist's chair, take comfort in knowing your practitioner probably isn't calculating how your jaw structure would affect a hanging. Progress, it seems, sometimes means separating professions that never should have been combined in the first place. Though one can't help but wonder if modern dentistry might benefit from just a fraction of that old executioner's efficiency, if not his bedside manner. Chapter 14. Medieval Dental Fashion. In an era when personal adornment often walked the line between macabre and magnificent, medieval Europe developed one of its most peculiar vanity trends, the wearing of human teeth as jewelry. What began as superstitious amulets evolved into a full-blown fashion statement among certain circles, transforming the remnants of dental misery into coveted accessories. A noblewoman might pair her finest silks with a necklace of carved molars, while a knight could accent his armor with a charm made from his own extracted incisor. This was an age that literally wore its suffering as decoration, where the line between trophy and talisman blurred with every sparkling smile. The practice had ancient roots, stretching back to prehistoric times when warriors wore the teeth of fallen enemies as proof of valor. But the medieval incarnation was distinctly its own creature, blending elements of mysticism, medicine, and pure vanity. The most common iteration was the simple tooth charm, a single molar or incisor drilled through the root and hung on a leather cord. These were often worn after particularly difficult extractions, serving simultaneously as a memento of suffering endured and a ward against future dental woes. The logic, to the extent there was any, held that a tooth once removed could never ache again, and by carrying its physical remnant, one carried that protection as well. Quality teeth became a bizarre form of currency in certain markets. A well-preserved molar with intact roots might fetch more than a chicken at some country fairs. Particular value was placed on children's milk teeth, believed to hold special protective powers, leading to a thriving underground trade in purloined baby teeth. The wealthy preferred teeth with interesting pathologies, molars with dramatic cavities or eye teeth, twisted into unnatural shapes, paying premiums for what amounted to miniature sculptures of suffering. Some particularly status-conscious nobles commissioned portraits featuring their dental jewelry prominently displayed, the painted teeth often rendered larger and more grotesque than they had been in life. The methods of preparing dental jewelry ranged from the simple to the elaborate. Peasants might simply tie a string around a tooth and call it a day, while the aristocracy sent their extractions to specialized workshops where goldsmiths would mount them in precious metals. The 14th century saw a brief but intense fad for tooth reliquaries. Tiny silver cases shaped like mouths that opened to reveal the precious dental contents within. A Venetian craftsman named Carlo dei Denti became famous for his miniature dioramas featuring teeth arranged in biblical scenes, with particularly large molars standing in for mountains and carefully filed incisors, serving as angelic wings. Different types of teeth carried different symbolic meanings. Caninas were particularly prized by hunters and soldiers, believed to impart courage and ferocity. Molars represented endurance and the ability to grind through difficulties. Front teeth were considered romantic charms, sometimes given as twisted love tokens, a practice that must have made for awkward conversations when the donor's smile revealed obvious gaps. Some regional variations developed. French courtiers favored delicate arrangements of children's teeth set in brooches, while German burghers preferred massive, yellowed grinders worn as visible pendants. The church's response to this trend was characteristically mixed. While some clergy condemned dental jewelry as pagan holdovers, others embraced it. Certain monasteries became known for their holy tooth amulets, molars allegedly from saints or martyrs, often accompanied by elaborate backstories about how the holy person had calmly extracted their own tooth mid-martyrdom. Pilgrimage saints sold teeth, supposedly from biblical figures, at exorbitant prices. One Spanish monastery claimed to have 6 of the Virgin Mary's wisdom teeth before being exposed as frauds using pig mold. Medical quicks quickly capitalized on the trend. Itinerant tooth drawers began offering guaranteed jewelry quality extractions for premium prices, promising to remove teeth intact rather than shattering them in the process. Some even provided decorative boxes for storing the removed teeth, anticipating the Victorian tradition of saving baby teeth, but with significantly less sentimentality. The more unscrupulous practitioners would secretly replace a patient's extracted tooth with a less impressive specimen, selling the original to wealthy collectors. The military developed its own dental fashion subculture. Veteran soldiers often wore necklaces strung with teeth knocked from opponents in battle, creating ghastly trophies that rattled with every movement. Some mercenary companies adopted unit insignia made from their members' extracted teeth following particularly brutal campaigns, the dental displays serving as both bonding ritual and intimidation tactic. A few inventive warriors even filed their own teeth into sharp points before battles, creating living jewelry that would presumably terrify enemies during close combat. Royalty took dental fashion to its most absurd extremes. King Henry IV of England supposedly wore a necklace containing all his extracted teeth, each one mounted in gold and engraved with the date of removal. The French Queen Catherine de' Medici commissioned a clock whose pendulum was a human molar suspended on golden wires. The most bizarre royal dental artifact may have been the tooth chest set owned by Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II, with black pieces carved from stained molars and white pieces from carefully bleached incisors, all supposedly from his own mouth over years of dental trouble. The decline of dental jewelry came gradually as dentistry improved and extracted teeth became rarer. The Renaissance emphasis on classical beauty standards made gap-toothed smiles unfashionable, reducing the supply of available teeth. The Protestant Reformation discouraged what it saw as morbid Catholic superstitions, including tooth relics. By the 18th century, wearing human teeth had become largely the province of eccentrics and country folk clinging to old ways. Yet echoes of this strange tradition persist. Modern dental implants and veneers represent a kind of inverted version, not wearing lost teeth as adornment, but wearing adornment as replacement teeth. The Victorian practice of weaving hair into jewelry follows similar impulses of bodily remembrance. And in certain subcultures today, extracted wisdom teeth still occasionally appear as punk accessories or gothic charms, proving that even in our sterilized age, part of us still wants to literally hold on to our pain and display it as a badge of survival. So the next time you see someone sporting a shark tooth necklace or other organic jewelry, remember, it could be worse. You could be living in an era when dinner party conversation starters included inquiring about the provenance of your hostess's molar earrings. Progress may have spared us many dental horrors, but it's also robbed us of what must have been fascinating cocktail party fashion choices. Chapter 15. The Legacy of Medieval Dentistry. The echoes of medieval dentistry linger in every modern dental office, hidden beneath the sterile surfaces and polite professionalism like ancient bones beneath a newly paved road. That faint medicinal smell, a distant cousin to the burning herbs once used to mask the stench of decaying teeth. The reclining chair, a civilized evolution from the wooden stools patients once had to be strapped to. Even the bill at the end of your visit carries faint whispers of its ancestry. Medieval tooth drawers might not have accepted insurance, but they understood the art of making people pay dearly for their suffering. The instruments of torture have undergone the most dramatic transformations. Where once rusted pliers and red-hot pokers reigned supreme, today's delicate probes and ultrasonic scalers perform their work with almost embarrassing gentleness. The modern dental drill, that whining nemesis of cowards everywhere, is a far cry from its ancestor, the hand-cranked bone auger that sounded like a ship's rigging in a storm and hurt like the devil's own corkscrew. Yet the fundamental principle remains unchanged. Something sharp must go where nature never intended it to. We simply swapped brute force for precision, trading the certainty of agony for the mere possibility of discomfort. Perhaps the most telling evolution is in how practitioners present themselves. Medieval tooth drawers wore their bloodstains like badges of honor, their aprons stiff with the evidence of a day's work. Today's dentists hide behind masks and gloves, their weapons concealed until the last possible moment. Theatricality remains, but the performance has changed. Gone are the drummers and the cheering crowds, replaced by soothing music and polite small talk about vacation plans. One might argue we've lost something in this transition. Where's the drama in a quiet fluoride treatment compared to the spectacle of an executioner dentist dangling your extracted molar before an applauding crowd? Our understanding of oral health has advanced in ways that would baffle medieval minds. The concept of brushing teeth daily would have seemed as absurd to them as washing one's skeleton might to us. Fluoride, dental sealants, orthodontics, these would have been taken for witchcraft and not the helpful kind. Imagine explaining to a 14th century peasant that people now voluntarily pay to have metal wires tied to their teeth for years on end. They'd assume we'd perfected some new form of penance that made the hair shirt look positively luxurious. Yet for all our advancements, some human experiences remain unchanged. The dread of the dental chair connects us across centuries. That moment when you hear the tray of instruments click into place still quickens the pulse just as it did when those instruments were being heated in a brazier. The universal language of dental pain needs no translation. The white-knuckled grip on the armrests, the frantic waving when you need to spit, the way time distorts so that 30 seconds feels like 30 years. These experiences bind us to our ancestors in shared misery, though thankfully now with better pain management. The psychological scars left by medieval dentistry run deep in our collective consciousness. Modern dental phobias aren't just personal quirks, but inherited trauma, passed down through generations like a cursed heirloom. That instinctive flinch when the drill starts? That's your genetic memory recalling ancestors who had teeth removed with blacksmith's tools. The reluctance to open wide? Centuries of evolutionary conditioning telling you it's never a good idea. We may sit in ergonomic chairs instead of stocks, but part of us still remembers when dentistry was a spectator sport with the patient as both player and ball. The professionalization of dentistry represents one of civilization's quieter triumphs. What began as the domain of butchers and barbers became a legitimate science, though the path was anything but straight. The 18th century saw the first dental schools, where students learned anatomy instead of just how to grip firmly and yank decisively. The 19th brought anesthesia, transforming extractions from horrors to mere inconveniences. By the 20th century, dentists had become respected professionals rather than feared torturers, though old stereotypes died hard. No other medical professional has to work so hard to convince people they're not the enemy. Remarkably, some medieval dental concepts have found unexpected redemption in modern times. The use of honey as a wound dressing, once standard practice, is now being revisited for certain post-surgical applications. The medieval emphasis on herbal remedies has inspired research into plant-based antimicrobial rinses. Even the much-maligned toothworm has enjoyed a partial rehabilitation, not as an actual creature, but as a metaphor for how bacteria tunnel through enamel. It turns out our ancestors weren't entirely wrong, just spectacularly misguided in their specifics. The social aspects of dentistry have undergone perhaps the most radical transformation. Where once dental problems were public spectacles, they're now intensely private matters. No modern CEO wants his board members knowing about his root canal, whereas a medieval lord might have displayed his extracted teeth as proof of his fortitude. Our ancestors would be baffled by our vanity about dental imperfections, To them, a missing tooth was a badge of honor, a visible record of pain endured and survived. They'd likely find our obsession with perfectly straight white teeth as bizarre as we find their necklaces of rotting molars. As we look back on this journey from the dark ages of dentistry to our current era of relative comfort, it's tempting to feel superior to those who came before. But before we judge too harshly, consider this. In another 500 years, our dental practices will likely seem just as barbaric. Future generations may shudder at our primitive fillings, our crude implants, our willingness to sit still while strangers drill into our bones. They'll marvel that we ever feared the very treatments designed to help us, just as we marvel at medieval resistance to bathing. The true legacy of medieval dentistry isn't in the tools or techniques we've abandoned, but in the perspective it provides. Every time you recline in that padded chair, every time you receive a painless injection instead of a swig of whiskey, every time your dentist asks if you're comfortable rather than telling you to stop being a baby. These are victories hard won through centuries of trial and error. That faint metallic taste in your mouth, that's the ghost of history reminding you. It could be worse. You could be biting down on a leather strap while a man with forearms like ham hocks prepares to rearrange your jawline. So the next time you find yourself dreading a dental visit, take a moment to appreciate how far we've come. Smile at the absurdity of those who came before, even as you carefully floss. And perhaps spare a thought for all those suffering souls whose agony made our comfort possible. Though maybe don't think about them while the hygienist is scaling your teeth. Some historical perspectives are best contemplated from a safe distance, preferably after the Novocaine has worn off. The story of dentistry is ultimately the story of human progress itself. Messy, painful, often illogical, but gradually, inexorably, moving toward something better. We stand on the shoulders of giants, though many of those giants had terrible breath and worse teeth. From blood-stained town squares to antiseptic treatment rooms, from screaming public extractions to whispered conversations about flossing techniques, the journey continues. Where it ends, nobody knows. But wherever that may be, one thing seems certain. It probably won't involve frog ashes or executioner's pliers. And for that, if nothing else, we can all be grateful.